First, I'll welcome the committee, and that's Peter Jacobsen, who is the chairman from the department, and Professor Paul Drews, and you are from Lüneburger, not Lüneburger Heide, as we know everybody, all here in Denmark, because of the Second World War, but Lüneburg. And Leuphana University in Lüneburg, Germany. And then we have Associate Professor Torben Tambo from Aarhus University. That means not Aarhus, but Herning. Yeah. So welcome to the committee. And then naturally I'll also welcome Fatemeh Rahimi, who will defend her thesis today. And you know that you have 45 minutes. And if you need 5 minutes, we can talk about it, but not 10.
Okay, so we spend 10 minutes to talk about that 5 minutes.
Then we can, so you will have to organize your time. The examiners are Lars Vam there, and then co-supervisors Charles Møller from Aalborg University, and Anders Haug is not here.
No, he's not present.
Sorry?
He's not present. He couldn't make it.
Yes. Yes, and I am chairman of this session. Oh, we have Anders Haug now. Yeah. Yeah, and welcome to you. And Anders is from the South, University of Southern Denmark. So I think we will start with the title you have there. If you should say which are the 2-3 most important words there, you will have the chance to say, because there are 10. So, and after your presentation, we will take a break of 10 minutes. And then we will have all 3 committee members, starting with Paul, and then Torben, and then Peter. And there will also, after their contribution, there will also be possibilities for other people to ask questions or give their comments. That's, I think, the most interesting thing today. So I'll give you the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to welcome you all. Thank you for being here and sharing with me this important day. Today I will present a summary of my Ph.D. study. As you can see here, the study is titled Management of Business Process Design in Global Implementation of Enterprise Resource Planning Systems. The objective of the study was to develop a framework of business process management capabilities that could actually support and improve business process design when implementing global ERP systems. But before starting the presentation, I would like to first thank you all. Afterwards, I had the pleasure to conduct this study in collaboration with GIA Process Engineering. So I have my industrial supervisors here with me today, Lars Norsaved and Benjamin Hansen. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I would also like to thank DTU and especially my academic supervisors, Lars Vam, Charles Mola, and Anders Haug, for actually guiding me throughout this research. Thank you very much. So here is the agenda for this presentation. I will start by telling you about the motives behind this study. Then I will present the research questions and the challenges the questions were supposed to address. Then I will present a brief summary of the 5 studies I conducted in the course of this thesis. And finally, I conclude the presentation by telling you about the practical contribution and also the future research. So, globalization. Globalization is not really a new concept. It has a history longer than a couple of 1,000 years. However, the rate and scope of globalization have intensified over the past half-century. We can see this fast pace in the significant growth in the number of multinational corporations. Globalization is tightly related to integration and control. In fact, multinational corporations are at a strategic disadvantage if they are not able to control and coordinate their complex network of activities that are dispersed all over the world. Therefore, investment in global IT system is typically a part of the globalization process. Globalization has especially increased the popularity of global ERP systems in multinational corporations. Global ERP systems support control and coordination in two important ways. First, these systems provide the technological capability for collaboration and communication across time and space. Second, global ERP systems provide a common language across multinational corporations by unifying business processes and data structure. However, implementing an ERP system in a global context is much more difficult than local implementation. When it comes to technical aspects, implementing a global ERP system requires attention to server sizing, storage capabilities, and also network requirements. However, the advances in ERP software and hardware has reduced the importance of technical constraints, but business-related difficulties still remain. Business process design is actually an important concern when implementing a global ERP system. Deploying a global ERP system as a control and coordination mechanism requires common process and data standards, but it is often very difficult to reach a consensus on common processes and data standards. Therefore, implementing an ERP system is tightly related to business process management concept. Business process management is a structured management approach that coordinates and continuously optimizes an organization's business processes. BPM enables successful ERP implementation not only by supporting business process design during the implementation, but also by enabling business process improvement after the implementation. Therefore, it's actually greatly important to implement BPM before or during an ERP implementation. To implement BPM in an organization, there is a need for 6 BPM capabilities. These are alignment, governance, method, information technology, people, and culture. Although, despite the growing popularity of global ERP implementations, ERP research has mostly emphasized on the intra-organizational aspects of ERP implementation. When it comes to BPM research, there are very few studies on managing business processes in a global context. As a result, we know very little about ERP configuration in multinational corporations. Therefore, this study aimed at developing an understanding of the criticality of business process design in multinational corporations, and also elaborating on BPM capabilities that could support and improve business process design in the course of a global ERP implementation. To achieve this objective, I tried to answer these 3 research questions. Why is business process design critical in the course of a global ERP implementation? How can we support business process design in the course of a global ERP implementation? And how can we improve business process design in the course of a global ERP implementation? The research questions were actually quite broad in scope. So to narrow the scope and also to identify which BPM capabilities I had to focus on, I tried to use the practical challenges that I faced in GIA. As I mentioned, I conducted this project in parallel to global ERP implementation project in GIA. GIA could foresee several challenges with managing business process design during this project. First, GIA faced the question of how much uniformity it should exist in the way it did business in different subsidiaries, in a way that GIA could achieve integration at the corporate level without damaging local responsiveness, local competitiveness at the subsidiary level. Therefore, the first practical challenge had an alignment nature and looked for contingency factors that would influence process standardization. Second, GIA faced the question of how these process standards should be developed. Therefore, the second practical challenge concerned establishing governance mechanisms that would enable defining common process standards. And of course, it fell under BPM governance capability. Third, GIA needed methods that could enable consistent business process design in alignment with corporate business strategy and also IT systems. Therefore, the third practical challenge concerned methodological capabilities that would enable consistent business process design. And of course, it fell under BPM method capability. As I mentioned, I used these practical challenges to define the scope of my research questions. And here is how the three research questions address each of these practical challenges. As I showed you this capability model before. So based on the practical challenges, I limited my focus to alignment, governance, and method. In the rest of this presentation, I will tell you about my studies within each of these capability areas. So the first BPM capability I looked into was alignment. Alignment ensures a tight linkage of business process design to organizational strategic priorities, business capabilities, and IT systems. Reviewing the literature on alignment, I could see two issues. First, I realized that BPM and ERP studies do not provide a holistic understanding of factors that influence process standardization. Especially BPM studies, they take a mechanistic view to business processes and encourage process standardization mainly based on operational similarities. Second, I realized that while there are compelling arguments for and against process standardization, the earlier studies do not provide guidelines for actually resolving the dilemma between standardization and localization when implementing a global ERP system. So to address alignment, I conducted 3 studies. The first study looked into business process standardization in multinational corporations. The second study investigated ERP architecture in multinational corporations. And the third study looked into the association between process standardization and the international management strategy of multinational corporations. I labeled the first study Global ERP Implementation and Harmonization of Practices in Multinational Corporations. As I mentioned before, common process standards are actually a prerequisite for control and coordination. But multinational corporations often face difficulties reaching a consensus on these common standards. Therefore, this study tried to answer this sub-question. What factors influence process standardization in a multinational corporation in the course of a global ERP implementation? This question, in fact, supports the first research question of this study. I conducted this study in 2 stages. In the first stage, based on a literature review, I developed a framework that explained process standardization in multinational corporations. In the second stage, I tentatively tested the framework using 1 case study. And here is the framework. I structured this framework into 5 categories. The first category covers those factors that relate to corporate strategic and structural context, like international management strategy and resource dependency. This is with the assumption that standardized business processes are centralizing coordination mechanisms, and therefore their deployment in a multinational corporation needs to be in line with corporate strategic and structural context. The second group of factor is institutional context. This suggests that the institutional and cultural distance across a multinational corporation negatively influences the success of process standardization. This is because a subsidiary's institutional context increases the likelihood of misalignment between a standardized process and that subsidiary's context. Process standardization is also affected by the quality of the relationship between the headquarters and subsidiaries. The ease of communication and subsidiaries' commitment to, identity with, and trust in the headquarters positively influences the success of process standardization. In addition, a subsidiary's level of motivation and its absorptive and retentive capacity influences the subsidiary's willingness to accept common process standards, institutionalize them, and recognize their value. And the last group of factors includes those parameters that characterize the process itself. It is easier to standardize a process with a lower degree of variability. It is more difficult to standardize a process which is firm-specific and location-bound. So these framework, by taking a holistic view toward an enterprise, toward a business process. So not only looking at a process as a machine, but looking at the process as a social construct and also a system, provided a more holistic understanding of how process standardization is actually influencing multinational corporations. Then I asked myself, okay, if process standardization is a motive for global ERP implementation, but it's difficult to achieve, then what it means for the choice of ERP architecture. Therefore, the second study looked into the ERP architecture in multinational corporations. It actually took a critical view towards implementation of single-instance ERP systems and investigated factors that would influence ERP distribution decision. It especially looked into the influence of process standardization on the choice of ERP architecture. And therefore, in this way, it contributed to answering the first research question by answering this sub-question. How does the standardization of business processes and data structure across a multinational corporation influence the choice of ERP architecture? The literature review identified two groups of factors that influence process standardization: business-related factors and technical system-related factors. Because the influence of technical factors has been reduced, most studies suggest that distribution decision needs to be made based on business factors. If you look at business factors, you would see that if it includes elements like international management strategy, resource interdependencies, and cultural and institutional distances. And if you look closer, you would realize that all these factors, they implicitly or explicitly, they suggest process standardization as the decisive factor for ERP distribution. Therefore, the rest of the study looked into the association and actually the implication of process standardization on the choice of ERP architecture. The literature review suggested that lack of process standardization influences a single-instance ERP system in two important ways. First, as the level of localization increases, there will be more difficulties in information sharing and therefore less support for control and coordination. Second, accommodating diversified processes in a single system increases system total cost of ownership. In other words, process standardization moderates the relationship between a single instance ERP and its benefits. To examine this finding, I conducted a series of key informant interviews. The finding from the interviews confirmed the negative impact of lack of process standardization on single instance ERP benefits. But it rejected a direct relationship between process standardization and the choice of ERP architecture. They argued that implementing global ERP does not really enforce a high level of process standardization because a single instance ERP can still be configured to accommodate diversified requirements across a multinational corporation. So I showed these findings to Benjamin, and he told me that, okay, we need something more concrete, something that can actually help us deciding about these process standardization in GIA. So in the third study, I looked closer into process standardization. And the third study, in fact, investigates the association between process standardization and the international management strategy of a multinational corporation. This is because, if you can remember, the first study suggested that we actually need to align process standardization with the corporate international management strategy. So this third question tried to answer this sub-question. How does a multinational corporation's international management strategy affect process standardization in the context of a global ERP implementation? This question is in fact derived or supports the second research question of this study. Multinational corporations are grouped usually in two categories based on their international management strategy. Those corporations that look for local responsiveness and those that try to achieve global integration. International management strategy itself is reflected in two structural dimensions: asset configuration and headquarter-subsidiary relationship. So a global integration strategy is characterized by a functional structure and headquarters operational control. But a local responsiveness strategy is characterized by market-based structure and headquarters financial control over the subsidiaries. So actually, in this study, I used these two structural dimensions to assess the compatibility between process standardization as a centralizing coordination mechanism and the two international management strategies. So this analysis gave rise to two propositions. The propositions suggest that process standardization has a higher degree of fit with multinational corporations structured for global integration and a lower degree of fit with multinational corporations looking for local responsiveness. So here you can see it here. Then this degree of fit then positively or negatively influences the success of process standardization in the course of a global ERP implementation. To examine these findings, I conducted 3 case studies in 3 diverse cases. So the case studies, analyzed separately and also together, they supported the sufficient and necessary conditions for validating the propositions. So drawing on the propositions and also empirical finding, the study proposes a framework that suggests conditions of fit between process standardization and the structural elements of a multinational corporation. As I mentioned before, process standardization better fits multinational corporations that are structured for global integration. In such cases, standardization formalizes interdependencies across specialized subsidiaries and facilitates central management of dispersed resources. In addition, in such corporations, the role of the headquarters and its operational control over the subsidiaries allows for defining and enforcing common process standards. Standardization is less appropriate in multinational corporations structured for local responsiveness. market-based structure reduces the need for using process standardization for coordination. In addition, the headquarters' limited financial control over the subsidiaries contradicts the centralizing nature of process standardization. Therefore, in such cases, the scope of process standardization might be limited to regulating the interdependencies between the headquarters and subsidiaries. There is, in fact, a misalignment between asset configuration and the headquarters role in the other two combinations. Therefore, to succeed in process standardization, they first need to resolve these misalignments. So these three studies actually supported answering the first and the second research question. The first research question looked for an answer for why business process design is critical in the course of a global ERP implementation. This study suggested that, on the one hand, business process design, and especially process standardization, needs to be in line with corporate strategic, institutional, organizational, and relational context. On the other hand, process standardization is essential to deploy a global ERP system as an integrative mechanism and to reduce ERP system complexity. So business processes, they need to be deliberately designed considering these two opposing forces in mind. But this study suggests that when implementing a global ERP system, the bias should be in favor of process standardization to reduce the downsides of technical integration. The second research question looked for BPM capabilities that would support business process design. The third study looked into BPM alignment capability and suggested that the decision for process standardization needs to be in line with corporate international management strategy in terms of asset configuration and headquarters subsidiary relationship. It also provided detailed guidelines for actually realizing the alignment. In this way, this study challenged some previous studies that actually encourage process standardization, mainly based on operational similarity. But the second and third research questions also had another important contribution. They both emphasized the importance of business process governance. The second study suggested that business process governance is a prerequisite, central governance for managing business processes is a prerequisite for a global ERP implementation. The third study also suggested that central governance for managing business processes is a prerequisite for defining, enforcing, and maintaining common process standards. So this finding, in fact, encouraged my next study, where I looked into business process governance. Business process governance establishes relevant accountability and decision-making processes to guide actions in business process design activities. Reviewing the literature on governance, I realized that more and more studies, they encourage permanent business process governance over temporary governance mechanisms. However, there are very few studies on business process governance in the context of multinational corporations. A second issue that I realized was the lack of any association between business process governance and IT governance. This is despite the fact that business process design and IT system design is tightly related, especially when it comes to adopting ERP systems. Therefore, in the first study, I looked into business process governance. The first study looked into business process governance in the context of multinational corporations. So it actually tried, and it actually especially looked into the integration between BPM and IT management functions. So this was done by answering these two sub-questions. How is the BPM function structured in multinational corporations? Why and how do BPM and IT management functions collaborate? These two questions support answering, again, the second research question. In the first stage of these studies, we conducted a comparative literature review on business process governance and IT governance. These analyses indicated that there are overlaps in the accountabilities specified within business process governance and IT governance. The overlap is mainly with respect to business IT alignment and IT-enabled business value realization. So this could actually answer why BPM and IT management functions collaborate. So after figuring out why BPM and IT management functions collaborate, we looked into how BPM and IT management functions collaborate. So in the second stage of the study, we investigated the integration between BPM and IT management functions in one multinational corporation. We especially looked into business process governance organization and IT governance organization and how these two organizations relate to each other. As you can see in the figure, the integration between BPM and IT management functions rely on horizontal integration capabilities. So the liaison positions situated in IT governance and business governance structures are the main enablers of the integration between the two functions. If you look closer at this picture, you can also see two dimensions of integration or two properties of integration between the two functions. These two properties are direction of integration and also the planning level at which BPM and IT management functions collaborate. As you can see, process roles are imposed to the IT governance structure both at the strategic and operational levels. But IT roles, they only take the operational liaison positions in the business process governance structure. So facing variations in the direction of integration, I analyzed the case data to identify the contextual factor that causes this variation. And I identified the role of IT to be the mediating factor. So in the third stage, I used the three concepts of planning level of integration, direction of integration, and the role of IT to develop a framework that explains the integration between BPM and IT management functions in support of business IT alignment. In organizations that actually perceive IT as a business enabler, IT strategy only reacts to business strategy. Therefore, in such cases, we expect a sequential integration between BPM and IT management functions at the strategic level. In such cases, high-ranking process roles are imposed to IT governance, to IT management functions to communicate the BPM strategy and also to take part in IT decision-making. When IT acts as a business enabler, we expect a reciprocal integration between BPM and IT management functions. This is because in such organizations, they use IT and especially off-the-shelf IT solutions to improve their efficiency. Therefore, IT consultants can highly influence business process design based on the best practices embedded in such IT solutions. To enable reciprocal integration, both BPM and IT management functions, they include liaison positions at the operational level. And in organizations that use IT as a strategic driver, we expect a reciprocal integration between BPM and IT management functions at both levels. Because in such organizations, they actually subsume IT into business strategy. And therefore, IT is not only an enabler of business strategy, but also has an important role in defining the business strategy. Therefore, we expect reciprocal integration both at the strategic and operational levels. So this study, together with the second and third study, clarified the business process governance capabilities that would support business process design. And therefore, they contributed in answering the second research question. The second and third studies, they suggested a central governance, a central permanent governance for managing business processes as a prerequisite for a global ERP implementation. Central governance supports defining and enforcing common process standards. The study also highlights the permanent nature of these governance. Permanent business process governance prohibits divergence of process standards after the project termination and also ensures that processes are being continuously adjusted based on business evolution. In this way, this suggestion, in fact, contradicts the common temporary project-oriented approach toward BPM, which is very popular when implementing ERP systems. The fourth study suggests that after establishing the central BPM and IT management functions, these two functions need to be horizontally and reciprocally integrated at the operational level. This is to enable integrated design of ERP system and business processes. So process roles need to be imposed to IT management function to direct ERP configuration based on business requirements. ERP consultants also need to take the liaison positions in the BPM function to influence business process design based on ERP best practices. So the last capability, the last BPM capability I looked into was method. Method includes approaches and techniques that support and enable consistent business process design. When it comes to methods, business process design is typically associated with methods for process-centric modeling. But managing business process design, in fact, requires a more holistic understanding of the organization, especially in terms of business strategy and IT systems. Therefore, there is a need for a method that can model business processes in their context. Such a holistic approach toward modeling already exists under enterprise architecture management, but enterprise architecture management is still being perceived to be primarily IT-focused, and its application for BPM is in fact overlooked. So to gain a better understanding of enterprise architecture management and its application, I conducted the fifth study where I looked into the application of enterprise architecture management in 8 Danish organizations. As I mentioned, researchers and practitioners, they still lack a common understanding of enterprise architecture, meaning its scope and also its application. This, in fact, encouraged us to conduct a study to clarify the terminology and also various applications of enterprise architecture management. So this was done by conducting this study, which tries to answer these two sub-questions. What does enterprise architecture mean, and how do organizations use enterprise architecture management? This, in fact, supports answering the third research question. So, reviewing the literature on enterprise architecture, we identified 4 strands defining the term enterprise architecture. So, enterprise architecture is considered inherent enterprise structure, blueprint of an enterprise in its various facets, principles prescribing enterprise architecture design, and methodology guiding the design of enterprise architecture. This, in fact, shows a confusion around the term architecture. So this study builds upon the ISO definition of architecture and clarifies that enterprise architecture is not a prescription, description, or methodology, but the inherent structure of an enterprise. Enterprise architecture management then is an approach that supports planning, developing, and controlling the enterprise's architecture. Analyzing the various definitions of enterprise architecture, we also identified 3 perspectives on the scope of enterprise architecture. So, in its simplest form, some researchers limit enterprise architecture scope to technical information components like data, application, and infrastructure. A second group of studies extend the EA scope to also include business capability elements like business processes, organizational structure, and information assets. A third group of study extend the EA scope even further to include business strategic elements like mission, vision, and also elements of the business model. So we use these 3 perspectives on EA scope to develop a taxonomy that classifies the various applications and goals of enterprise architecture management. To develop the taxonomy, we mapped the studies on enterprise architecture management to one of these 3 classes based on the study's perception of EA scope. I will present the taxonomy a little bit later. In the second stage of the study, we examined the taxonomy by conducting case studies in 8 Danish organizations. Comparing the cases with each other, we identified 2 factors that differentiate the cases from each other. The first factor was EA scope. So the EA scope in each of these cases correspond to one of the 3 EA scopes that we identified in the literature review. The second factor that differentiates the cases from each other is the enterprise architect's influence over the architectural elements which are outside their EA scope. So enterprise architects in each of these groups, in more mature cases, they not only understand the environment to plan EA evolution, but they also actively try to influence the environment to better plan the EA evolution. We explain this observation by taking a system view toward an enterprise. Because enterprise architecture as an open system is not independent from its ecosystem, understanding and controlling its behavior requires understanding its surrounding context. As the knowledge about the environment increases, so does the ability to convert uncontrollable variables to those that can be influenced. So these studies suggest that, or these empirical findings suggest that the EA scope is not completely a context variable when it comes to enterprise architecture management activities. So I use this finding to refine the taxonomy, and here is the taxonomy. When EA scope is limited to IT components, enterprise organizations adopt enterprise architecture management to ensure coherent and consistent design of IT systems. Therefore, enterprise architects are supporting the processes for IT strategy formation, planning, and implementation. Business strategy is only an input to IT architecture design, but enterprise architects may still influence business strategy to better manage IT architecture complexity. When EA scope extends to cover business capability elements, the goal of enterprise architecture management is to ensure coherent and consistent design of business capabilities in integration with IT components. Therefore, the EA function formally supports the processes for business strategy planning and implementation. Business strategy is still an input for the design activities, but still, enterprise architects may influence business strategy by explaining its impact on business capability elements and also by providing input regarding the performance of business capability elements in realizing business strategy. And when EA scope covers business strategic elements, enterprise architecture management ensures coherent and consistent design of business strategy and business model in integration with business capabilities and IT components. The EA function formally supports the process for business strategy formation in alignment with internal resources and external environment. Because of their knowledge of the market dynamics, they may also influence the environment to bring it in line with business strategic goals. So, this study, in fact, supported answering the third research question. The third research question looked for BPM capabilities that would improve business process design activities. This study suggested replacing business process modeling with enterprise architecture modeling. Enterprise architecture management, with its multi-perspective view of an organization, not only enables aligning business process design with corporate business strategy, but also supports integrated design of business processes and ERP system. In this way, this study, in fact, challenges a traditional view toward BPM, toward enterprise architecture management, that limits the application of enterprise architecture management to managing IT architecture design and evolution. So now that I have told you about the 5 studies and also their theoretical contribution, I will present the practical contribution of this study. The study presents a framework of BPM capabilities in the form of normative propositions that support and improve the practice of business process design when implementing global ERP systems. When it comes to alignment, this framework suggests the need for aligning business process design with corporate strategic, institutional, relational, and also an organizational context. It especially provides guidelines for aligning business process design with corporate international management strategy. When it comes to governance, this framework suggests the need for establishing central permanent governance for managing business processes. It also proposes governance mechanisms for integrating business process management and IT management functions. To enable integrated design of business processes and ERP system, it also suggests the need for establishing an EA function that not only includes IT architects, but also business architects. And finally, when it comes to methods, this study suggests adopting enterprise architecture management, modeling, and analysis techniques. So, BPM is in fact a relatively new discipline. And this study only covered few aspects of BPM capabilities. So there are many areas to actually explore in the future research. Especially there is a need for studies that actually cover BPM culture and people capabilities that I actually completely ignored in this study. When it comes to alignment, this study suggests the need, actually provides an overview of the factors that influence process standardization. But when it comes to causal explanation, I limited my focus to a strategic and a structural context. Therefore, there is a need for studies that actually explore association between process standardization and social and organizational contingencies of a corporation or organization. When it comes to governance, business process governance has not really achieved any attention or very little attention from academia. Future studies could explore business process governance structural, process, and relational mechanisms, especially in the context of multinational corporations. There is also a need to revise the already established structural mechanisms to enable including IT roles and also enterprise architect in BPM activities. And finally, when it comes to methods, this study challenged a traditional view toward enterprise architecture management and suggested a trend for advancing the application of enterprise architecture management in organizations. But there is a need for further studies to further characterize the 3 enterprise architecture management archetypes in terms of EA function makeup, is integration into organizational governance and also the competencies of enterprise architects. This would also clarify the integration between BPM and EA function. So this was actually my lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. I guess now it's time for a discussion, but before that, I guess we have a short break. Yeah, thank you.